This is part 2 of the Labour Relations Act, and today we will be covering the relations in the workforce and dispute resolution mechanisms. Welcome to MKIE, and the first part of the video is going to have to do with industrial relations, collective bargaining, and industrial action. So let's start with industrial relations. Industrial relations are the relationships between employee, employer, and other institutions, such as the government. The aim of the Labour Relations Act is to establish industrial peace. So you can think of this as the relationship between you, a good teacher, and the PA. Collective bargaining has to do with employers negotiating with trade unions about employment conditions. These conditions can refer to employment conditions, salaries, wages, working hours, and issues relating to leave. So basically, you have the LRA to thank for protecting you against King Labuskaghni, his numbers, his whistle, and his jokes. The final part of the relationships in the LRA is industrial action. Industrial action has to do with how a worker can enforce their cause if demands aren't met through collective bargaining. So, here is where you can find any measure used to protest, strike, or just a voicing of someone's opinion. Common issues that cause industrial action are remuneration issues, having a trade union recognized, and if the employer changes working conditions unilaterally. So basically, they change working conditions without employees' input. So firstly, let's start with the most common form of industrial action, strikes. So the definition of a strike is where two or more employees refuse to work because of a work-related purpose. Now, there are two different types of strikes, protected and unprotected. Protected strikes are strikes that have been given approval by the CCMA. And in order to get a strike approved by the CCMA, you have to submit the issue. And if it can't be solved in 30 days, the strike is approved. This, however, doesn't apply to a unilateral change of conditions, as I said earlier. Now, obviously, an approved strike has positives to employees and everyone else. Like during a protective strike, employees have the security of the police and is protected from dismissal of the business. There are also other things in a protected strike that protects employees from employers. Specifically in a protected strike, employers cannot get a court to intervene. They are not allowed to seek damages because of a loss of production, and they have to continue to provide food and accommodation in the case that the employees live on site. Now, obviously, a strike is not protected when the correct procedure isn't executed, or if there is an agreement that says that workers cannot strike over a certain issue. So that was strikes, the largest segment of industrial action. And now I can tell you about other forms of industrial action. Number 1, a go slow. This is where employees still work, but slower to decrease productivity. Number 2, work to rule. This is where workers do no less than the bare minimum. Number 3, overtime bans, or where employees refuse to work overtime. Picketing, the second last one, refers to a situation where strikers strike right outside the workplace to prove a point. And only a registered trade union can do this. The fifth and final form of industrial action is a lockout. And this is actually the employers, where they lock out employees until the employees buckle to the situation. And also the employer does not have to pay wages when it is a protected lockout given by the CCMA. That concludes relationships for this section, and we can now move on to the final part of this huge act, and that is dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, there are 3 subtopics here, and they are collective bargaining, the CCMA, trade unions, and Nedlac. 4. Now, let's start with collective bargaining. Now, we've already been through the concept of collective bargaining, and now we'll just focus on the structure of how it works. So, collective bargaining is administered through the use of bargaining councils. These councils can be formed between employees after the approval of Nedlac. If you don't know what Nedlac is, don't worry, we'll get to it later. These bargaining councils negotiate any collective issues that affect employees, like wages and benefits. They are also allowed to negotiate policies, disputes, and training programs. Another structure that is important in collective bargaining is a statutory council. These councils are similar, but are more informal because it doesn't require approval. A statutory council has to have at least 30% representation of employees and employers. A workplace forum is the final structure for collective bargaining, and this happens when 100 or more employees come together to discuss issues. If there is an unsolvable issue, it is forwarded to the CCMA. This here leads me nicely into my next part of dispute resolution mechanisms, the CCMA itself. Now, you have heard me say these 4 letters over and over again, but what do they mean? The Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration settles disputes between employees and employers in order to avoid conflict in the workplace. So the CMA of the name here stands for things the CCMA does. The first one is conciliation. This refers to a process where a third party sits in on a debate and will just control it, but will not make any points to sway the debate. This is like me arguing with you and just having a teacher sit in. If conciliation fails, mediation will follow. This is the exact same as conciliation, but in this case, a recommendation is made by the third party, but this recommendation does not have to be followed. And if the parties disagree on this recommendation, this will lead to arbitration. Arbitration is where the third party will actually tell the respective parties what to do, and their decision on the outcome of the situation is legally binding. Now, obviously, this doesn't please everyone, and if a party is unhappy with the situation, then it can be brought to the labor court if it's done within 6 weeks. That finishes CCMA, and now we can move on to trade unions. So I'm sure you've heard the term trade union before in this video, and if you can remember correctly, you will recall me saying that trade unions are the organizations that involve themselves in collective bargaining. So I've covered the concept of a trade union, but I haven't covered the structure of a trade union and all the nitty-gritty things. So a trade union is an organized group of employees that come together to negotiate matters of the business environment that they aren't happy with. These negotiations usually have peace, working conditions, health, safety, remuneration, restructuring, and fair treatment in mind, because that is a function of a trade union, to give employees a voice they wouldn't otherwise have. Now, due to trade unions being recognized in the Labor Relations Act and the Constitution, trade unions give power to a collective that is unnoticed. Businesses don't engage in collective bargaining with individuals, but do with trade unions, and because of this, it is very important that trade unions exist. Some of the unions in South Africa include the Congress of South African Trade Unions, known as COSATU, the Federal Unions of South Africa, FEDUSA, and the National Council of Trade Unions, or NACTU. So we have now come to the last part of dispute resolution mechanisms, and that is Nedlac, or the National Economic Development and Labour Council. So you can essentially think of Nedlac as the intermediary of communication between organizations, such as business to trade union. Because what Nedlac does is engage in conversations that aim to stimulate economic growth and create a better country overall for us South Africans. Now, clearly, this is an important job for an organization, and because of this, the LRA grants Nedlac the ability to intervene any dispute resolution mechanism when talks of socio-economic policy are involved. Guys, we are finally done with the Labor Relations Act. After nearly half an hour of me just going on about legislation on legislation. Now, because I know you zoned out somewhere, here is what we learned. And just remember that you can click these links on the side here and go back to recap a particular section. So, in this video, you learned what industrial relations are, the structure of collective bargaining, the different forms of industrial action, and the 4 different dispute resolution mechanisms. I really hope you did learn something here. This was Keroshan Pillay with you, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.